I was wondering how you want to do that. We have one extra chair, so. Yeah, so we can coordinate.
For back and forth.
Yeah, that sounds good. I guess I'm starting, right?
Yeah, I wrote mine out. We're just
Okay,
going
great.
back and forth.
Yep. Okay. Okay, thanks everyone for sticking it through. We're getting close to the end, although some of your flights have been grounded, so you might be here longer than you wish. We're going to start again with some of the panelists from both of the prior symposia. Tricia and I are going to alternate with questions, probably go down the row. And I'm going to begin. The first question that I have is, and this goes for both the U.S. and the U.K. contingency here, but what's the most important component that you would like to see in a guidance framework? So in the U.S., for example, that would be from BOEM and the Fish and Wildlife Service on compensatory mitigation and voluntary conservation measures for bird species impacted by offshore wind. And if you want to expand to other wildlife, you're welcome to, but if we could start with birds, that'd be great. If you're ready to go, Joel.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So I hope this isn't a cop-out answer because it's several answers together, but I guess it would be an overall approach that allows for the inclusion of best available science and knowledge that's evolving over time, that gives a picture that's a balance between being too general and too specific. Because I think what we've seen here, and also with a lot of other discussions, we had this during the panel that I was on earlier about what is an appropriate amount of specificity that we're trying to get to, what's reasonable. So I think just a general approach of inclusion and adaptation to improvements in knowledge and methodology, but then also just a real acknowledgement of what's realistic to expect for how precise of an answer we're trying to get, because I think it needs to reflect reality and reflect important parameters, but not try to get to the 10th decimal place, which is a unattainable, unrealistic outcome.
I think for me it's monitoring, just making sure there's really, really robust monitoring in place so that if someone's saying we're going to do this, put this compensatory mitigation measure in place and it's going to have this effect, have some way of actually testing it, improving it and demonstrating that it's having the effect that you're wanting it to have.
And I'm going to actually ask Kate, if you'd like to step in here and add on to Angus's comments, please go ahead right now.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I agree with everything that's been said already. I add a couple of things. I think one is that it's really helpful to think about the bigger picture here. And I think something that's starting to happen a little more in the UK is that we're looking at our sort of conservation plans for seabird species and trying to use those to sort of set the context of really what are the big challenges for seabirds, alongside offshore wind. There are much bigger challenges that seabirds in the North Sea are facing than offshore wind development. And so sort of using those conservation strategies that already exist in the different nations within the UK to really sort of set that big picture context of what are the challenges, what are the mechanisms or the sort of causes of those challenges for seabirds, and then can we sort of link our compensatory mitigation into those so that we're really delivering, I guess, more of that sort of strategic, holistic compensation that really delivers conservation outcomes for species rather than, where we have been in the UK, which is that very sort of project by project, which I think risks approach, which risks missing some of these, maybe bigger opportunities to sort of really make a difference to seabird species. And I think that's particularly true in the case of things like this, the shifting baseline that Anthony was talking about earlier. It's recognizing how we think that baseline for sort of seabird abundance or the integrity of our species networks for seabirds, how we think that's going to change in the future because of these other pressures, and building that understanding into the way that we deliver compensation, so that hopefully the interventions that we make are resilient to those changes that we know are coming.
Thanks. Emily?
I don't know that I have all that much more to add, but I guess what I keep thinking about listening to all your talk is just flexibility, something that's flexible and can be adapted over time.
Yeah, I think the two biggest issues, at least that I feel are important about this question, is developing that guidance and that framework for what the Fish and Wildlife Service and BOEM are really talking about with mitigation, compensatory mitigation in the or not so much in the service, but like so that conservation banks and ILFs in LUFI programs can actually evaluate that and decide if they want to jump into this. I think it would be awesome to have a third party like that involved. And then I said this a couple of minutes ago, I think figuring out the credits and debits for red knots, I think is going to be a really big deal ecologically, and also really a policy challenge as well, for sure.
I don't have too much additional add, except I think I would echo the flexibility thought that's been mentioned a couple of times, and not trying to be too super specific, but I do think it'd be good within the, to have some discussion of uncertainty and how we'll be thinking about treating uncertainty. And also, I think some discussion of baseline and what we can and can't be expected to understand about baseline, and that should probably be dependent on the time, should be dependent on the time frame of the change we're looking to monitor, right? Some thinking about it, I think, would be useful in terms of when it's okay to make certain assumptions and not okay to make certain assumptions. Yeah, and I think it would be really neat to see information about how you might have these kind of joint mechanisms, possibly third-party mechanisms, but also if there's a possibility to talk about allocation, because I think that came up a bit earlier in the discussion about Egypt, right? Like, how do we think about having these projects where there might be an allocation of, how one might allocate a pooled resource back out and who should contribute what into that fund? So.
Great. We're going to shift a little back over now to net positive impacts, and moving from compensatory mitigation, thinking about what we'd like to see in guidance relative to that, to just the idea, we've heard, a number of companies are working on NPI goals. In particular, companies are developing their own frameworks and criteria for selecting priorities for species and habitat, or how they select what they're going to focus on for their NPI goals. So how important is it to the success of the concept of MPI, I guess, to have a standardized approach for the way we select our priority species and habitats relative to that concept? And I guess I'll start with Kate, because one, she's up there, and also because she kind of talked about the limitations of the project by project approach and how you miss opportunities with that. So
yeah, sure, thanks. I feel a bit like some sort of floating deity sitting above you. So yeah, it's a really important question, I think, and I think it's really excellent actually to see industry really sort of taking a lead and pushing this forward and coming up with their own methods. I think that's really important. And I think one thing we've really learned in the UK is that it has to sort of, there has to be this trust and this sort of joint effort across, industry, researchers, regulators to really make this work. So I think that's really important. But I would say that I think it is, for me, I guess, as a scientist, I think it's really critical that there is strategic oversight of how that prioritization works. And this is a sort of really hot topic of conversation in the UK at the moment, because we have had this project-based approach, and we've also had this sort of like-for-like approach. So we've kind of put an emphasis on, well, if you kill 100 kittiwakes in this location, what we really want you to do is make 100 more kittiwakes in the same location. And I think now that we're sort of moving away from that, we really need to make sure that we have this kind of strategic oversight of the way that interventions for both compensation and net gain are prioritised, and the way that species and populations are targeted. There needs to be strategic oversight of that, because what we really need to make sure is that the sort of overall integrity of the species networks is okay and is resilient, and actually of the wider ecosystem as well. So for me, I think it's really critical to have a sort of standardized strategic oversight of that prioritization.
Thanks. Julie, we can go down this way on that.
Yeah, I made a similar comment earlier on a different topic where I think there are some elements where standardization is really important, and then specificity can be brought into a standardized framework. And I think I have a similar opinion here, where yes, there definitely does need to be standardization of some elements and certainly of the data that's outputting, but it has to be a standardized framework with sufficient flexibility to allow for site and project and other specifics to be input.
I guess it can be, I guess the sort of whole net gain compensatory mitigation thing, there's a sort of fairly broad overlap, and it can be a bit hard to work out where one starts and the other, or one ends and the other begins. And I guess part of it is that maybe there's a bit more flexibility around the net gain options, because that's a sort of voluntary measure that the companies are delivering, whereas the compensatory mitigation is much more of a regulatory pressure. So I guess it's thinking about, well, maybe we can have a bit more flexibility about the measures that we're proposing for net gain, but we're a bit more restricted in what we're doing in relation to compensatory mitigation.
I liked Kate's phrase, strategic oversight. I was thinking of a little bit softer, like strategic guidance, that RWSC is, through all of you, is well positioned to provide that strategic input into the types of projects and focal species and things like that, because no offense to the companies, but you all might propose something that you're really good at or that you're already doing in another place, and that might not be the best solution. So having a body that's made up of you plus all of the others, like RWSC, that can provide that sort of, let's look across everything, decide collectively as a group what we want to prioritize and think about. And I like Kate's phrase, strategic oversight. I'm going to take it.
No, I think, I think standardization to some extent is helpful. I think we have to be a bit careful that we're probably not, it's going to be a work in progress to get to that standardization. I think there's going to be something that looks disorganized that eventually will become organized right over time. But I think through some of the initiatives that are going on that I've mentioned before, right, I think we're getting toward companies working together and thinking through how does this all lead to a common reportable outcome, because what we don't want to have a situation where there's uncertainty and concerns similar to what's come out recently related to some concerns about the carbon credit market. We don't want to have a similar concern about biodiversity net positive markets, or if there are credits for biodiversity, right? So I think having some standardization is useful, but acknowledging that we're talking about a lot of resources, a lot of species, that there's going to be a diversity of things that will be being done, right, to get to demonstrating that goal. So I think it's going to be a mix for a while.
I'm going to start with Kate and then Anthony and go down the opposite direction this time. So this question has to do with how you think the offshore wind industry should address uncertainty around estimating both impacts to birds as well as the efficacy of mitigation measures. And for Kate, there was a question from the audience that had to do about population viability analyses, and maybe Scott can answer this if the Fish and Wildlife Service is using, how they're using these as well. That was another audience question towards helping to address uncertainty. And cumulative effects impacts as well.
Yeah, it's a really key question, and I like what everyone has I think we've sort of touched on this and some of the things we've already, in some of our answers to some of the other questions. And I sort of agree with everything that's being said. I mean, in terms of the impacts, yes, you certainly need to recognise the uncertainty around it. You need to sort of take a sort of holistic view of the predicted scale of the impact and the uncertainty around that. And then I think the sort of level of stringency in terms of the requirements for compensatory mitigation need to reflect, both the magnitude, but also the uncertainty around that. In terms of the impacts, certainly. But then in terms of uncertainty around mitigation measures, yeah, I really liked what Angus said about sort of having more flexibility on the sort of net gain side than the compensatory mitigation side. I think that's a really important point. And I think that greater flexibility will allow us to be a bit more creative and go for some of these sort of less well understood but potentially really beneficial interventions to sort of reach net gain. So when I think about seabirds, one of the things we might try and do that would be great to do in the North Sea is increase forage fish populations. But how do you do that in a demonstrable way? And then how do you demonstrate that impact in terms of breeding success and survival for seabirds? That's really hard. There's a huge amount of uncertainty around that, and yet there's potentially massive benefits that could be accrued to all seabird, populations that are foraging on those forage fish species. So I guess it's about sort of having that flexibility. And I think one thing that would be really excellent, and this is, I think, maybe being talked about in the UK now, is this idea that because there is all this uncertainty, particularly around interventions for mitigation and net gain, that what we really need is a system where you have a sort of independent expert panel, basically, that would sort of meet regularly, annually, perhaps, in the way that we have with some other institutes like IC's working groups operate in this way. So, and they would essentially, it'd be a group of experts. They would look at all of the monitoring that's been done. They would look at the scientific evidence, and they would attempt to sort of come to a position on, we think this is how well this intervention is working in these, in this specific set of circumstances. And they'd sort of synthesize that evidence and their opinion, basically, about how well it's working. And then that needs to sort of feed into the process and, I suppose, sort of link back around into the sort of requirements that regulators are asking of developers as well. Yeah.
I think there's a couple of things that we could do about the uncertainty question. I think, well, there's the data side of things, right? So we're going to be getting more data as time goes on, and I think that can help to inform some of that uncertainty. So I think figuring out and I know Kim, who's in the audience here with Orsted, has been working a lot on figuring out how we share and work with the data that we are collecting. I think will be helpful in figuring out how we reduce some of that uncertainty. I think we also have to be comfortable with uncertainty to some extent. I think everyone working on restoration knows that things work sometimes they don't. They might work really well somewhere, but then they don't work where you're trying to do them. So I think trying to be able to be adaptable relatively quickly, I think, is going to be important in terms of not, if something doesn't seem to be working, right, reallocating those funds. And that's where maybe these kinds of advisory committees could be helpful in that there's not real time, but a relatively real-time process of feedback to say, we're not seeing the impacts that we wanted to see. Of course, the challenge for this is how it intersects with the timeframes that we might think we might see gains, where how are you going to know that something isn't working, right? Like, when are you going to know it's not working or not? And I think that's where there's this additional thing where I think industry, right, a lot of times, as part of our bid process, we do have funds that go toward research, and I think that's where there may be opportunities for us to kind of dedicate some research funding, if educational institutions are interested in, of course, into these questions of uncertainty and evaluation across these mitigation options. So.
Yeah, I think just the one thing that I would add, completely agree to the previous comments, but I think because there is that uncertainty on the debit side, there is uncertainty on the credit side, at least when it comes to compensatory mitigation. And I think doing the research that you just mentioned, Anthony, I think is really critical. But being really transparent about about the debits and the credits, and being very, very clear about what we know, what we don't know, what we're estimating, what we're hoping for, and then being able to be adaptive, I guess.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of kind of involving an entity like RWSE in this is that you have that link to the research part. So if you have certain projects or actions that have high uncertainty, you can kind of put that into the other bucket of RWSE and say, hey, we need more research on this. How do we get the information we need to have more certainty for this other bucket of RWSE that's related to mitigation and NPI?
I guess I think there's maybe a couple of areas. I mean, I think firstly, I think the sort of adaptive management approach is really important. You need to sort of be monitoring, and you need to see, is we've done this, is it having the effect we're thinking about? Yes, great, carry on. No, it's not. We'll try something else. But I think at the same time that the sort of speed at which we're needing to do things maybe doesn't lend itself quite so nicely to that, because like seabirds are long-lived species. You might not see the types of responses you're hoping to for sort of 5-10 years till you've made the intervention. So I think at the same time there's a need, and this sort of relates to a lot of the work that Kate does. I think there's a need for sort of properly quantifying sort of uncertainty from the start to the end of the process. So sort of rather than just saying, oh, we're uncertain about this, so we'll take a precautionary value, and we'll take a precautionary value about this because we're uncertain about it, and just piling a precaution upon precaution, trying to sort of do the sort of fully end-to-end quantification of precaution and incorporating that in all our models. But I think it's a sort of tricky situation.
You want to add something, Joel? Okay, yeah.
Okay, so this next question we're going to challenge. We're going to give you the chance, I guess, to have an opinion on an assumption, which is that net gain and net positive impact on biodiversity whether that should be a collective ambition. In other words, should it be kind of uniformly and consistently encouraged by government, states, embraced by companies as something that we're striving forward on collectively? And if your answer is yes to that, then what do you think might be most helpful in terms of policy mechanisms, incentives, governance structures, in helping us kind of meet that collective ambition?
So yes, I do think it should be. I also think it should be a collective ambition. So yes, an ambition, but also specifically on the collective part, partly because of the fact that offshore wind projects are next to each other. The animals move. I mean, just the nature of it just very much lends itself to a collective approach. I think this has been said a lot of times, but I think that the big element of that is the definition and the monitoring piece. So I think in all of those things that you talked about, from the companies to the regulations and all of the other pieces you mentioned, I think that has to be the core of it.
Yeah, obviously, I think, yes, it should be done, and it should be a sort of, everyone should be getting on board with it. I think one key area I feel would be a sort of openness to try things and accept that maybe we might not get things right all the time, and maybe some things will work and some things won't, but just the openness to sort of embrace the fact that we need to try things, and sometimes they'll be more effective than others.
This might be our last question.
So when you frame the question that way, yes, I think we should work towards that. But then I was like, why just offshore wind then, right? Like, many more opportunities in other industries to apply this concept to. And so yes, to offshore wind, but then when you ask the broader policy questions, like, well, let's do this for everything.
Well, I've been trying to, contain my comments related to compensatory mitigation, but I will say when we first heard about this concept of net conservation benefit, I was like, wait, what did you just say? You guys are willing to do like more, net positive and not, just maintain. And I thought it was the most amazing thing I had ever heard in my career, seriously. So, I mean, to talk about it being collective, to completely agree. But I think it's amazing that these companies are doing this work.
I mean, unsurprisingly, I think it'd be great. I think it's great if this moves forward. But I think just on the actual mechanisms of trying to make something like that happen, I think yes, the companies individually and the offshore wind industry can move this forward. Those members of the offshore wind industry who have net positive goals, right? As Joel mentioned, Ursa's not the only one, right? There are several others who are not in the room right now who do also. But I do think, right, there's a point at which, just to put it concretely, right, the question has come up, right? Well, if Ørsted is using their net positive ambition and they don't develop a site, but someone else who doesn't have that, who is not a wind energy developer, goes in and develops that site, like what does that mean for biodiversity? And that's where I think, right, we get back to the role of the voluntary versus the regulatory environment being set to make sure that things are happening that are positive for biodiversity. And so I do think, right, that there's a role for government, much as kind of what's being done in the UK, right, in terms of mandating perhaps not a target, but some kind of biodiversity net gain that's associated with development, right? Because then, like Emily was saying, you're moving it across rather than just thinking about offshore wind. You're thinking about all of the other kinds of sectors that also are having impacts on biodiversity.
Great, and let's not forget about our deity, Kate.
Yeah, I'm regretting saying that now. I definitely agree with everything that's been said. I think it should be collective, and I think it's exciting. I think it's actually a real opportunity to make a difference to some of these species that are really, really struggling because there are so many impacts and threats that are affecting them at the moment, and it feels like a really good moment and a sort of really big opportunity to take a sort of collective strategic approach to this to really, make some differences to some of these species. So yeah, I think it's a great opportunity, and it's great to see. It's great to see all of these conversations happening in different countries and, across different stakeholders, to see industry really, really leading on it as well.
Great, thanks. So I think that's a wrap for this joint panel. I want to thank our panelists for some who did double time.
Yep.
Right? So thank you to all of you. And are we breaking or going right into closing?
Lunch?
Okay.
Oh.
Right into closing? Okay.
Auditorium.
So auditorium.
Thank you.
Oh my God, it's just like every day.
Thanks so much.
Did a lot of
I don't know what happened.
Thank you. That's great.